when needed.
All right, sounds good. And I can help take notes alongside someone, but yes, it's always best to have more than one person involved. Thank you, Hannes. All right, I'm going to kick us off. Hopefully, folks filter in over the next couple of minutes. Peter said he should be able to join us, so hopefully he's here soon. Good morning or afternoon or whatever time of day it is for you all. Welcome to the WIMSE interim meeting for October 7th, 2025. Today's topic is going to be the WIMSE architecture document. This is an official interim meeting of the WIMSE working group. Anything here is covered by the normal IETF note well, so please note it well. That also includes have a collaborative spirit, and let's try to work together here. With that, the only thing on the agenda today is the WIMSE architecture, and this is intended to be, at least was initially intended to be a sort of a working session for the draft architecture document in helping it move towards working group last call. I am now going to hand the slides over to Joe. You're going to be presenting, right?
Yes, I will.
All right, you should have gotten a you should have gotten a
WIMSE.
pop-up.
Yeah, I think I got the right one.
If that's revision 1, we should be all set.
Yeah, it's what I think I clicked on in the slides.
Excellent. Just before you start, Joe, just a quick reminder to everybody: unless you are actively speaking or presenting, please keep your microphone and video off. To ask questions, join the queue. And with that, go ahead.
All right. So thanks, folks, for joining today. As Joseph mentioned, we're going to go over the WIMSE architecture document, kind of some of the recent changes, some of the issues that we know about that are open, but we're also fairly certain that there are probably other things that should be covered in this document, and we'd like to get some feedback on that in this meeting if possible. So the agenda is kind of going through what we have, but definitely this is meant to be interactive, and feel free to ask questions, provide feedback during the presentation. So skipped over this slide. So we just recently, I believe last week, published a new revision of the document. It updated some definitions, and which we'll go through. It all aligned with some of the OAuth work in the cross-domain area, some rework of authentication section, added some information on audit, and we added an additional AI use case targeted at AI. We still have a few open issues. We've been pretty good at knocking some of them down, but there's still things to work out around terminology, key management, attestation, the concept of bound tokens, identity. Some of this we can get into today. I don't have slides on all of this, but certainly would love to talk about it if folks have interest in these areas. So just looking at the cross-domain use case, just to kind of give an overview, the basic change here is we added an external token service that Workload 2 interacts with to get a token to talk to the external service instead of having everything happening in the same domain. The reason why we did this, of course, was to align better with the cross domain identity chaining draft, which basically discusses this flow. And so we feel that this kind of is pretty good now with respect to cross domain and being aligned with work that is ongoing in OAuth. It does still show other interactions can be possible depending how federation and all of this goes on. But we wanted to make sure that we were representative with kind of the up-to-date work that's happening in the OAuth working group. So I don't know. I know Peter had some comments on this in his in the GitHub issue tracker. I don't know if anybody else has any feedback, but we'd love to hear if you have any concerns or think other things need to be added, or if this looks like it's good or at least in the right direction. So Arndt.
Hey Joe, I support it. There's just one pattern I wanted to ask if this is considered, and that is particularly in SPIFFE, it is often done, cross-domain is often done by mutually trusting signing keys of the other domain. So particularly with mutual TLS, you kind of say, okay, this workload, in your case, workload 2, also trusts the bundle or like a trust domain of the external service and vice versa. When it's particularly interesting when there is no token service.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, we kind of hinted that in the first scenario. I'd have to look at. I don't think we may not exactly cover the exact language that you used in terms of sharing a trust bundle. But you can see from workload 1, there's a direct communication with the external infrastructure. So I think we do consider it, but I think that probably it could be improved, and perhaps it would be a separate case that we could point out with workload 2. So if you could maybe at some point in the couple of days take a look and see if that text that is accompanies this section kind of addresses that, or if you think we need to add something else, that would be cool.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, the intent is to kind of capture some of it. We won't be able to capture all of the things, but I tend to agree. Like, I think we intend to capture that case, Art. So thanks for bringing that up. All right. Any other questions or comments on cross domain? Now, Yaroslav, are you able to join and maybe give an overview of the AI agent edition here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So we've added one more use case specific to AI agents. So we claim that from WIMSE perspective, AI agents is defined as a special kind of workload. And we distinguish between two kinds of AI from identity perspective. So there is delegated AI agent and autonomous AI agent, and talk about identity and context associated with these two use cases. And then perhaps from our perspective, the most important area of all is AI to AI delegation chain. There is obviously a lot of interest right now across the board in AI agents, speaking to AI agents, many exciting protocols being developed for that use case. So we decided to, without going obviously too deep into potential protocol specifics, highlight the most important aspects of passing around security context when logical flow goes from user service to AI agent A to AI agent B to workload downstream. So again, the goal here is not to be prescriptive. in terms of what AI agent interaction is supposed to look like, but more about highlighting potential pitfalls and encourage some good practices when it comes to workload identity in context of AI agents. Any questions, suggestions, remarks? It's a very new topic, obviously. Mark.
There is a lot of attempts in the industry right now to tackle this, as I'm sure you know. And I do not know if there is sort of one guiding force behind it. So, of course, the danger is everybody goes their own way and it will be really, really hard to reconcile. But I just wanted to add that there is a recent paper published by the CSA. I'll probably find it if there's like a chat I can share. But it's published by the Cloud Security Alliance, but it's also kind of appears to be joint work with Microsoft. And it's a very ambitious proposal. It combines decentralized identities, verified credentials, zero knowledge proof, and a new type of naming service called Agent Naming Service, ANS. So very ambitious. And if it wasn't for Microsoft backing, I'd be like, you guys are trying to boil the ocean. It seems like a lot. But they highlight things like inability in OAuth and OIDC and SAML to perform like the necessary kinds of delegation. But I would encourage people to in this area to familiarize with themselves with as many different proposals as possible, so that we can, take the best practices from everywhere.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. And again, I'd like to stress that here we're not looking to be prescriptive about specifics of the protocol, but talk about, again, common practices that should apply regardless of which identity encoding and centralization, decentralization you go for. But yes, do please share the document in the chat. Thank you. Brian.
Thanks for bringing that up, Mark. It reminded me that I went to look at that document expecting to be concerned by the ambition of it, but found that it was gated with a login registration with CSA, which I do not blame you for, but I do find pretty distasteful when that kind of thing is promoted to
I'll email
open
the
foundations.
PDF to the mailing list. How about that?
That's beautiful. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other notes, suggestions, feedback on the exciting AI agent use case? Peter? No?
No, I just wanted to say thanks for adding it. I think it's good to have this as a point of view, and I think it is. I'm glad to see this. Thank you for adding it.
Thank you for your positive feedback. Joe, back to you.
Okay, great. So moving on, one of the issues that came up with in the review and issue list is consistency with SPIFFE, and I think we do want to maintain a high level of consistency with SPIFFE. We certainly, I think, want SPIFFE IDs to be valid WIMSE IDs. Perhaps the WIMSE set of IDs is a superset of what can be expressed in SPIFFE, but we certainly would want something that could be expressed in SPIFFE to be a valid WIMSE ID. And I'm definitely would love to hear people's thoughts on what exactly the consistency goals are, because I think that's important to for us to define in the architecture document. I believe the details of how that's achieved could be done in the architecture document or a separate document, but there are some areas where we have potential inconsistencies, and Yaroslav, I don't know if you wanted to kind of go through some of those, that would be great as well.
Yeah, thanks. So SPIFFE ID is quite prescriptive in a number of areas, rightfully so. So, for example, SPIFFE ID limits the total length. Oh, not limits the total length. It mandates minimal length that endpoints SPIFFE talkers should be able to process. I believe it's 2048 bytes, and recommends not going above that length because it's not guaranteed that your peer will be able to process that. To me, it sounds like a sane recommendation that should apply to all the schemas. And then another really good requirement that I think we should adopt is no usernames and ports within host names. So it's kind of confusing when you use URI as your identifier and then add usernames there as and ports. Then SPIFFE has a number of restrictions when it comes to character sets in both hostname and path. So we may want to consider adoption the same set of restrictions. So for example, no percent encoded characters. However, SPIFFE goes as far as allowing IPv4 addresses in hostnames and not allowing IPv6 addresses in hostnames because they contain colon, which could be hazardous character. So obviously, we're not in a position to change SPIFFE requirements. Whatever we define might be more relaxed compared to SPIFFE, and then SPIFFE scheme would do their more restricted thing, but which still obviously would be valid WIMSE identifier. But given that we will likely have other schemes in addition to SPIFFE, it would make perfect sense to have slightly more relaxed requirements. Mark, you're in the queue.
Yes. So I've been monitoring this discussion on the mailing list, which I think is going to be very important, and that is about how rich how much richness can you convey in the identifier, right? So, in SAML you have all sorts of like these assertions, right? So you can convey sort of fairly rich set of claims, whereas in an SVID, I mean, here we're talking about path restrictions and we're talking about character set restrictions. Eventually, it's going to create sort of a ceiling on how much information you can convey inside an identifier. So we may have to look at ways of expressing richer identities while perhaps sticking to these concerns. So again, I will mail to the mailing list, so we don't have to discuss it here, a couple of ideas, but one of them would have to do with like self-describing identifiers, maybe carry style. Another is this really interesting, what is it called, DPID, and it has to do with a persistent identifier that allows you to fetch additional metadata. So it's persistent metadata about an identity, keeping the identifier itself perhaps like short, but allowing the recipient to learn more. So we should, again, maybe as a way of like an issue we track in WIMSE would be a really good thing for us to discuss, how we're going to convey the necessary level of richness and what the tools are.
Okay, there is a comment from Michael in chat. SPIFFE sounds like it's trying to do regex, and if it can do colon, then sounds like there are bigger issues. I believe that the biggest argument of SPIFFE for such restriction character sets is to reduce chances of implementation shooting themselves in the foot or even more sensitive places by having confusion of where hostname ends and path begins and all other dangerous things. URIs can be scaringly flexible. Peter?
Yeah, so I think back to your original question about the consistency goal, my view here is that I think we definitely never want to get to a place where a SPIFFE ID cannot be a WIMSE identifier, right? I think that to me is we need to be able to say that in part, like SPIFFE is so widely deployed, commonly used, etc. And then to Michael's point, yes, the restrictions on SPIFFE identifiers comes from painful deployment experience and is worth paying attention to. And I think Yaroslav, if you haven't already, it might be good to just talk more with Evan Gilman on this topic if you can get hold of him.
My gut feeling on the SPIFFE ID allowing for IPv4 but not IPv6 is that it implicitly allows IPv4 because it's just numbers and dots. And this is effectively the same as a domain, somewhat, right? But for order to allow IPv6, it would actually start allowing columns on the host path and the authority part. So I think and I've never seen it. I've never seen an IPv4 as a trust domain there, and I wouldn't even say it's a good thing to do. I don't see the need for it. Regarding supporting WIMSE ID and SPIFFE ID, there will always be the scheme which will allow you to clearly tell which processing rule applies. So I do think there is potentially some flexibility. What I see more important is that WIMSE in general and the drafts support both ID schemes, SPIFFE ID scheme and the WIMSE ID scheme, right? And with that scheme identifier, I'm somewhat okay with having a couple of different rules on it, because it's going to be super clear which one apply.
Right. The point that I was trying to make, if we are defining a more general approach to workload identifiers, WIMSE identifier that might support multiple schemes, some that exist today, some that might exist in the future, then we still need to have some kind of rules so that is implementers who treat those identifiers as opaque would know what they have to deal with and what is a malformed thing.
Okay, so like a meta scheme.
In a way, yeah. I mean, URI is a meta scheme, yeah, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Justin. I think Justin made a very relevant comment. In the wild, vanishingly few developers use proper URI parsers and instead throw regex, set the problem, and hope for the best. Yeah, and yeah, we should change that. That's my opinion. Joe?
Yeah, I guess responding to two things. One is for IP addresses, I would really kind of try to avoid that. I mean, maybe there's a use case for it. I'm not aware of one, but if people have one, it'd be good to bring that up, because or else I'm going to push for limiting IP addresses in that hostname field. The other thing I just want to bring up is, yeah, with the scheme, I think one of the things we want to do is we can have SPIFFE as a scheme, but we need to start thinking about what WIMSE, if there is a WIMSE scheme and right now, and what that would be if it's differentiated in any way from SPIFFE other than it says WIMSE. And we can certainly have multiple schemes, which is where I think we can get into things that Mark was referring to of how we maybe structure the identity in such a way that it has more meaning if we want to go down that path. Thanks.
Hannes? Hannes?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. I have a question for Arndt. Arndt, you were talking about the IPv6 or IP address use case, and I wasn't quite sure whether you agree that you don't see a need for the use case of using IPv6 in particular, or you do see a need. I wasn't able to capture that.
I don't see it, because the part there is indicating the trust domain, and that would kind of mean that this IP is the trust domain, and that would kind of you're getting into very narrow scope trust domain, right? And this is just the trust domain part, not the identity part, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I don't see it.
Makes sense. Thanks.
All right, some productive, constructive discussion here. Joe, can we go to the next slide? Okay, now one open question that we still have, there was some discussion on the mailing list, is do we want to progress with WIMSE identifier as a separate draft? So I believe authors of architecture draft have consensus that's the right thing to do, so that WIMSE identifier could be very tight document specific to this, would be very stable standards track document. Architecture would be a separate information track document as it exists today. And then, as Peter suggested on the mailing list, perhaps there is also a place for BCP identity document that would talk about potential path constructs, what good looks like. That would be more living document. Any comments on this topic? Arndt.
I'm sorry that I haven't read your draft proposal, but in general, we're having this discussion here, and I feel like giving the identifier a separate venue as a draft helps drive these discussions, right? Because the architecture, there will always be other things. We had it before with the cross-domain and so on. And Justin mentioned the URI parsing and the thing, which could be a nice security consideration, right? And that's all very specific to the identifier. So I kind of support having it as a separate document, whether it's a BCP or not. That is, yeah, I don't know. But in general, giving the identifier a dedicated venue is something I feel like would be good.
Thanks, Arndt. Joe.
I was just going to say I don't think I would want to break this up into more than 2 documents right now, like the architecture document and a separate identifier document. And that I think there are multiple ways we can split it up. If we were going down the path of defining a specific scheme, I certainly think that could be probably belongs in a separate document no matter what. But then when we get into what are the rules, the meta rules around an identity, that would, that I could see being in the identity document, which is I think the intent that we had with kind of the existing document to kind of cover that. But it could also be in the architecture document, and then if we have a concrete WIMSE identifier that we want, that could be in that separate document. So I think there's a little bit of ways we can split it. I would, at this point, unless we're going to have multiple WIMSE schemes, I would probably try to stay away from splitting up into too many documents. But I do think it could be helpful to have a separate document. Although I'm also hopeful that we're going to be able to progress the architecture document a little bit more. Yeah, is my audio not doing well?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. All right.
It's yeah, it's fine with me as well. I think it might be on your end, Peter.
So yeah, I would like to get some feedback, because if we're going to split right now we have the information in 2 documents at the same time and they're starting to drift, and that's not ideal. So I'd like to kind of close the loop on this and see if we can see if the working group is amenable to adopting a separate draft on identity.
Yeah, one other point I'd like to make, one of the reasons for a separate identifier draft, it came up in conversation with some enthusiasts from other working groups that want to refer to WIMSE identifier when they talk about workload identity, but they don't want to refer to architecture or anything bigger than WIMSE identifier. So from kind of collaboration with other working groups, I think there is an argument for it as well. Fleming. I cannot hear anything. Yeah, sorry, looks like your microphone is not working. While Fleming is fixing his microphone, anyone else wants to express an opinion on this topic? Brian is asking, is WebBottles one of those working groups? Well, it's not yet a working group, so yeah, I don't know which way are they going to go. Okay, Fleming says support separate draft, but concerned about too many drafts. Consider with discussion as well. Peter, Justin, do you want as chairs comment on that?
Yeah. So generally speaking, the chairs don't have strong opinions whether the working group decides to split up work and publish it in smaller pieces or put it together in larger pieces. I do want to remind the working group that the architecture draft was initially proposed and intended to be sort of a close follow document of once we publish the pieces. This describes how all of the major parts go together and not be an upfront sort of prescriptive way of describing everything that would need to be filled in. So having something that normatively defines a key portion of what is in the architecture as its own draft fits that model just fine. Anything that the working group does in terms of document structure needs to be confirmed on the list, but we do have full control over how many documents we use to fulfill any of our particular charter items or working group deliverables. As far as just general guidance on whether one document or multiple documents is right, I've seen it done both ways. I've seen it work both ways, and I've seen it go horribly wrong both ways. So I don't think that there is a solid answer. Joe, you look like you were going to jump in.
I was going to ask if there are particular guidance on if, would it be appropriate for the chairs to run a adoption call for the identifier draft to see if the working group feels that splitting up the work is a good idea?
We can do that if that is the desire of the authors of the architecture draft here and of the identifier draft. If you would like to officially put that in for an adoption call, the chairs can do that. And then we'll get the answer from the group.
I think we'd like to do it, but we'll get together and make a formal request so you guys have that, and then we can do an adoption call. Yeah.
Yep. Sounds good to me. Peter? Peter might be having audio issues.
It looks like it's contagious.
All right. I think go ahead, Jaroslav.
Joe, can we go to the next slide, please? Let me cover that, and then I'll hand it later. Right, terminology, workload. So when working on workload identifier draft, we identified that workload is not identified. We don't really have a strict definition of workload that we could refer to. There are multiple conflicting definitions in other places, and maybe we don't need to define workload after all. However, feels that if we're reasoning about identifier, architecture, and other things, we should have a way to express what we're talking about with certain degree of certainty. So the current proposal is a workload is independently addressable executable software entity. It's obviously not ideal, maybe too broad, but hopefully that's a starting point for discussion. The idea behind this is that it includes microservices, containers, virtual machine servers, serverless functions, and also potentially services that consists under the hood of multiple workloads. So the question to the group, what do you think about this proposal? Do you think if workload should be defined? So any initial thoughts before we take it back to the list? Joe?
I think there are some, well, one I in particular, I think Fleming had some ideas on workload terminology, and Arndt, you probably should get and ask your question in the on the mic, because I think it's a good question. Because we do want to try to settle on kind of the minimal definition here that doesn't, not overly restrictive, but gives an idea of what a workload is.
Yeah, so my question on the chat was, based on this description, I understand it in a way that a couple of instances behind a load balancer are the same workload because they're not independently addressable.
It depends on your point of view. They could be, if you're looking at them from the outside, they're not independently addressable, hence you reason with them as with a single workload. But if you're on the inside of the load balancer, so if you have one of those load balanced workload to another, then you do have an independent address. So you can have best of both worlds.
Okay. Yeah, at first it makes sense to me with this explanation. It is, however, very vague in a way that it's basically both, right? Like I remember in the service-to-service draft, we talk about that a workload can be a logical or a physical unit sort of thing, right? Which kind of makes it a bit more clear that you can see it either way. With this description, it's much more vague, and it really comes down to how you interpret it. Yeah, but in general, I feel like it matches it, but I also worry that it's very vague, and maybe it's just better to say it depends how you see it, and it's either this or that.
Yeah, and I think Fleming posted in the chat that it's still important to support he thinks it's still important to support the notion of a workload instance versus a service that consists of multiple instances of the same software image. So maybe in this definition, we should kind of point out that there are these two cases. We don't need to necessarily say more about it other than to maybe expand that to eliminate the confusion that Arndt had of, like, you know, it sounds like we're talking about everything behind a load balancer is one thing. Well, it could be when you look at it from one way, it's one thing. You look at it from the other way, it's multiple things. So I think we probably need to resolve that ambiguity in some way here.
Okay. Joe,
could we simply tweak this? I'm sorry, I'm jumping the queue here. Could we perhaps simply say it's an entity or a group of entities, a group of indistinguishable entities, to get around the load balancing? Because I believe that is important. But ultimately, I think that the spirit of workload is that it is out there, it will perform a certain function, you expect it to perform certain functions, you should be able to talk to it as an entity. Now, it may be a collection of cooperating entities, so that's fine, but it acts as one, I think, is the key here. Like, its composition is ultimately irrelevant from the point of view of asking it to do things or asking it to identify itself.
Yeah, so perhaps then expanding this definition to be explicit that software entity may include one or more pieces of something, but the key here is that it is independently addressable from a certain point of view.
Correct. So I would say a software entity or a group of related entities.
I'm going to encourage everybody to not bike shed this definition on the call. There are better uses of our time, and this type of wordsmithing can hit either the list or the issue tracker. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for words of wisdom, Justin. Joe, over to you to keep us going forwards.
Okay, thank you. One other bit of terminology that we had some just trying to reconcile this with other places where there are similar definitions. And one of the places is in the transaction token draft. They use a terminology called external endpoint, which is a published interface to a trust domain that when you hit it will result in the invocation of a workload within that trust domain. So it's very similar to our gateway service definition, which is kind of an external endpoint separating domains. We also have a notion of identity proxy, which includes a kind of an authentication or token exchange and transform function in it as well. So I don't know that it seems to me that these definitions aren't necessarily conflicting in that they're saying using the same word for two different things. They're using two different words for very similar things. I don't know if we really need to reconcile it, other than perhaps it would make some sense for us to say, a gateway service could be an external endpoint. Is similar in concept to an external endpoint in transaction tokens. I don't know if anybody has strong opinions on that. Peter?
Let's see if this works. Can anybody hear me?
You're a little bit faint, but we can hear you.
Okay, I'll try and speak loudly. My perspective on this one, Joe, is I think a gateway kind of, certainly to me, sort of also suggests that it's a bit of an aggregation point for lots of other things. External endpoint, it may just be an API, right? It's not necessarily an aggregation point for other things. If I think about API gateways and things like that, right? So I think similar concept. The external endpoint to me feels a little bit more granular, where the gateway sort of has this notion of being maybe more of an aggregation point for multiple things. Just an idea.
Mark?
Would it make sense to differentiate between active and passive gateways? So, like for instance, if I'm doing data leakage prevention, like it's in the gateway, it's in the way, and it will actually also modify traffic in some way and perform a control of some sort. Versus a load balancer, you kind of expect that it's a clean pass through. I don't know if it makes a difference from the identity standpoint, but it really does. The active one really does change what the ultimate workload, that's the destination, will see.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think for the most part, the way we're thinking of it is more as a gateway is it performs some active roles. It does things like authentication. It could do other things. We didn't really think of it as, we thought of it in the context of what would be for the identity flows and maybe not data loss prevention and other things. Those functions could be co-located with that service. But I think they would be somewhat separate from a conceptual point of view.
I mean, I see a lot of stops between the originator and the servicer of the request. They're usually in series. They do different things. So load balancer is one, TLS terminator is another, web application firewall, DLP. You basically hit a bunch of them. And from the point of view of the requester, none of that matters as far as identity is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it may make sense to sort of double click on that a little bit and say that the point of the gateway is that it really needs to preserve the identity of the workload that will ultimately serve as the request. Because if that's the difference, right? In some case, it may start calling additional services and doing like
Right.
active work processing it, versus just like simply modifying filtering traffic a little bit, but only has one thing behind it.
Yeah.
To me, that's what makes a gateway gateway, is that it doesn't really change the identity of what's behind it. Versus if it's it's some sort of a virtual machine that's ultimately now servicing the request and will do its own things, and God knows like how many different services it's going to invoke. Well, it doesn't convey the identity of some other backend behind it. It is a thing in itself.
Right. At a certain point, the additional service becomes a workload in itself, in a sense.
Correct.
And that it's
Correct.
going to be
But a
processing the
gateway,
packet.
not in a sense of a uniquely identifiable workload, unless you want to talk to the gateway and manage the policy on it, which is different.
Right. Okay. Yeah, this is a good topic, George.
Yeah. So I guess, thinking about this a bit from a transaction token perspective, right? Your gateway, your API gateway, if that's what is the sort of boundary from your trust domain, may have other things in line, as Mark was saying, but the API gateway would effectively function both as the gateway and the identity proxy at the same time. Right? Because the gateway itself, could include the transaction token service. So it could be basically transforming tokens. It could be dealing with identity transformations. It could be, doing a bunch of things. And at that point, the gateway probably does need its own workload identity, especially if it's going to be the thing that is, let's say, signing the transaction tokens. So I don't know how to sort of like separate all these concepts when I think you could map multiple into a single running workload. So is the main issue like when a workload should have an identifier or not? Like, is it that kind of a question, or is it more just useful terms in the context of the architecture, but not necessarily terms that need to be ubiquitous across deployments?
I think the original intent here was useful terms in the architecture, in that you will have a typical architecture will have some gateway like functionality in it that would convert from the external domain to the internal domain, in a sense, in terms of identity. But these things, if it is, say, issuing a transaction token, then it would have to have that sort of identity. But that to me is sort of a separate concern, in that if the gateway is the transaction token service, then it would need to have that. Otherwise, it may be talking to a transaction token service, and it would still have to have some sort of identity, right? So it seems like you won't be able to get away from the gateway from having some sort of identity, at least for a management purpose. Yeah.
Right. So I think in this context, then if the issue, if it's, we probably don't need to sync too much terminology between the two environments, unless those who've read both feel like it's confusing, in which case we should do it. But if we don't think it's confusing, and and we're using slightly different terms to address a particular concept within the context of that document, and we're not looking to make sort of like ecosystem level terms, it's probably not that big a deal to to leave them as they are.
Peter?
Yeah, I just typed something in the chat because audio is unreliable. But maybe one way to look at this is like an external endpoint can be a gateway, right? But it does not have to be one. Whereas a gateway really is an external endpoint, right? So maybe that's a way to look at it as well.
Okay, thanks. Mark?
Specifically on the transaction tokens, very important. And you can add transaction tokens and sort of build a transaction chain as you traverse both identity preserving and identity modifying because they're orthogonal, they serve different purposes. So I think it is certainly, from the way I think about it, it's important to differentiate a sort of a point through which you transition, whether it be a gateway or identity proxy, specifically on this one dimension. Does it preserve the identity? Does it pretend to be another workload, or hide what's actually going behind, or does it really expose the identity of the workload you intend to be speaking with? Right? And yeah, it might be building transaction tokens as you go through, and that's fine. That's effectively for a different purpose. But I really do like, now that I think about it, gateway basically saying we are separating your domains. This you're entering another thing, and an identity proxy that simply says, oh yeah, you're among friends, and I may not be the one servicing your workload, but I am still the payroll database.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll need to kind of work through that a little bit, but I think it makes sense to me that, like, I think the purpose of the gateway service was to separate domains, and that's an important part of it. An identity proxy is kind of a logically separate entity from the gateway for the purpose that it may appear in multiple places. Okay, Hannes?
As a question to George, I was surprised that he was saying that we don't need to synchronize with the terminology with the transaction token draft. George, why do you think so?
Well, if we're using terms that are sort of like intended to be within the context of the purview of that document, right, to convey a particular meaning within that document, then I think, the documents are the words or the terms are to some extent scoped to the document, right? In the case of the transaction tokens, the point is to sort of like separate this context of the sort of external domain to the internal domain. And we can reference that generically as an external endpoint, whether that's an API gateway, whether that's a single interface like Arndt had put in the chat, right? It could be the external endpoint could be the SMTP inbound API, right? And it is the thing that then is the external endpoint. Whereas I think within the context of WIMSE and multiple workloads, right, there's a stronger focus on, the workload, and to some extent what Mark was just saying, in the sense of, is this workload sort of like changing the identifier of the requester or just passing the requester's identifier through? And I think, and then talking about those kinds of concepts, right, we may need different terms to do that. So that was my thought. If we feel like these terms are going to get used in an ecosystem sense, then I think we have a much bigger taxonomy problem, because there's many different ways to characterize the behavior. And then you have to look at, how multiple behaviors can be additive together into a single workload, right? This workload is performing these characteristics. And I was assuming that we weren't trying to build that sort of ecosystem-wide taxonomy, in which case the terminology, could be scoped, so to speak, to the specification itself. Happy to be wrong, happy to have, more conversations about this. It just struck me that I think we're trying to talk about concepts within the structure of the document, and trying to use the best words to describe those concepts, but not trying to describe that concept in a global way, if that makes sense.
Peter?
Quick time check. We've got 5 minutes left. I don't know if there's other topics that the authors wanted to cover with the remaining time.
Yeah, so I think we'll leave this topic for now. I'll briefly mention the next topic. I don't think we have time to really get into depth in these two areas. So these are areas that we have some issues in the issue tracker on that we haven't had time to kind of incorporate into the draft as much as we'd like. basically around key management. And then if you're looking to bind a token to a workload, is that a concept we're going to discuss in the architecture document? Some of these topics are very big, like key management and trust management, that are, if we're going to go into great detail in these, they would need to be in a separate draft. And similarly with something like bound tokens. So I'm going to skip through these right now, but this is certainly an area we would love to have a discussion on, either on the list or in the GitHub issues, or perhaps in some future meeting. But until then, we'll just look at like where we've been. We're having an interim right now. We'll have hopefully another draft before Montreal. And then we'd like to see, well, are we in a position to go for a working group last call? Certainly, we think that the service to service work will be well on its way, perhaps at that point. Maybe not certainly, but it seems that's a good assumption, and maybe it's appropriate to try to start working on, finalizing the architecture at that point, at least as a point in time. Or maybe we need to wait for other things to coalesce as well. Brian.
Thanks, Joe. Your comment reminded me that while I was feeling sorry for myself and looking at my own calendar next week, I noticed that the interim scheduled next week is actually on pursuing working group last call for the service to service, aka workload to workload document. Did I read that wrong? Not really for you, Joe, but for the chairs here.
Yeah, so you read that correctly. Originally, the service to service authors asked for 2 interims, one to sort of push work forward and solidify what were seen as some final questions at the time, and then the second one to basically discuss the things that would be needed to get the document into working group last call ahead of or at Montreal. So yes, you are correct. Next week's interim, which is about a month after the first interim on service to service, is in fact intended to push that doc to working group last call.
I think based on other events, we are wholly unprepared both for that milestone, and I won't speak on behalf of the other authors, but I'm not sure what we would say at that interim.
Okay, well, if we need to change the schedule for next week's interim, reach out to the chairs. We can alter that if that the schedule and topic no longer makes sense.
Okay. Yeah,
as it is, we're keeping it on right now until, so it's on unless you all see an announcement on the list that says otherwise.
Thanks for clarifying.
Reach out to the WIMSE chairs, and we'll, if there's something that needs to be changed, please make sure all the authors are CC'd. All right, Joe, if you have anything else to wrap up, we do need to button this up.
Yeah, I think the main thing we'll ask about is on splitting out the identifier work. Other than that, I think there's plenty of work still to be done on the architecture draft, and I think thank you for everybody who participated today, because it's been a really good discussion. So thanks.
All right. Thank you to Joe and to all of the other authors who put this work forward. If there are any changes that we need to confirm on the list, the chairs can help facilitate that, including splitting out the identifier document. That was the one specific action item that I took note of, so Peter and I can do that. Just as always, reach out to the chairs. Let us know when you have that doc in a place that we can put that call out. As far as working group last call and additional discussions, it sounds like there's still a bit of work to do. So let's get doing it, and let's discuss that in Montreal. Thank you, everybody. We might see you next week. We might not, but right now it is scheduled for next week. And if nothing else, we will hopefully see you all in Montreal. Peter, anything to add?
Nothing else. Just thank you everybody for the excellent work and progressing on the specifications. Really wonderful to see.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.